Thank you everyone for joining us today. Our presentation will be on expanding horizons, promoting inclusive science communication, or SciComm. Now, please do feel free to keep your cameras on or off. We are open to both. It's your preference, although we'd love to see your faces. And we will have questions interspersed throughout our presentation, so we welcome you to use the chat option to respond. So you'll see in the chat that we put up a little prompt for you guys to provide your responses, to tell us where you're joining from, how many languages do you speak, and what cultures do you identify with. Our presentation really deals with multicultural and multilingual SciComm, so we'd love to hear your responses in the chat. We also like to take the time to introduce ourselves as presenters. So my name is, did you want to, oh, there we go. So my name is Priya. All of us here today are joining you from Toronto, Ontario. And we'd like to, of course, acknowledge that we are coming to you from the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabewaki, Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, Mississauga and Wendake Nyan-Wentzio lands. So of course, definitely grateful for allowing us to be on these lands. Now, in terms of self-location for myself, I come to you here as someone who's lived and grown up in various different cultures and countries, having spoken different languages, including Tamil, Malayalam. I've also learned Arabic, and of course, English. Now, when we talk about inclusive SciComm, what that means for us is multicultural, multilingual SciComm at its very core. So to that effect, my passion for multicultural, multilingual SciComm really started as a result of having lived in and really learning from different cultures. I also found myself in storytelling as a journalist, as a public health journalist, and that really enabled me to understand the importance of storytelling and science communication in our ways of learning. And I also like to mention that through my interest in science and science communication, I found Lotus STEM. And Lotus STEM is a South Asian STEM networking and creative hub for South Asian women, which was founded by Rupali Chowdhury, who is here with us today. We had the fortune to be funded by an NSERC grant to develop science communication workshops in multilingual and multicultural science communication to help diversify SciComm and increase and enhance access to diverse scientists, and as well as a diverse public who are really eager to learn more and appreciate science and understand science. So this is sort of where I'm coming to you from, and I will pass it on to Celia as well for her introduction.
Thank you. So what do dosas have to do with SciComm? I actually, when I was completing my degree in science communication, my dissertation was about representing women in STEM. But through that project, I met other women of color and realized that there is a whole other angle here. And that actually brought me to working with IndiSpace, and the founder is also Indian. And so that means a lot of her participants happen to also be Indian, depending on her network. And there was one time we were talking about galaxies and we're describing galaxies. And usually the analogy was, you know, oh, this galaxy is like flat like a pancake, flat like a frisbee. And then the founder made the connection to her students that it kind of looks like a dosa, which you can see in the slide over here. And the reaction in these students was like, they got so excited because they saw themselves in science and something that they related to at home that maybe they didn't really see in school or in their normal social lives, they actually saw in this class. And it was really cool. And that reaction made me want to kind of foster more of that science communication, sort of outreach and education that touches on culture. And that kind of brought me to working with Lotus STEM and on this grant. So we want to kind of give it to you guys and ask, what do you think the value for multilingual and multicultural science communication is? What does it mean to you? And you can feel free to answer in the chat or hit unmute.
Sorry, can you ask that question one more time?
Yeah, what is the value for multilingual and multicultural science communication, or what does that mean to you personally? Inclusivity, that is a great answer. Thank you, Nancy. Yeah, people feel more seen.
I was gonna say that in the community that I live in a generation has become a minority majority, and mostly Hispanic, a lot of Southeast Asian as well, some Sudanese. But if the parents don't understand what's going on with the kids and what science and stuff they're studying and why, then it's a lot less important. So like we have a lot of our school communications, not necessarily curriculum, but school communications in both English and Spanish, and it's starting to be in another language as well. I don't remember which one. But I think it's so important to get the parents buy-in as these kids are having these interests.
For sure. Definitely, like there has been research showing that students who continue to study science after high school, for example, a huge part of it is parents and their support. And if the parents and kids they speak different languages because the kids are learning it in English and their parents speak a different language, it's hard to understand what's going on and then be able to offer that support, especially if you're like an immigrant to any country. I know like my parents also, didn't really know what was going on with university. Like they wanted me to go, but then what does that mean? What does that look like? So for sure, I see more comments. Empathy is a huge thing. It shows that the communicator cares about their audience for sure. Knowing what content might have special relevance to specific communities, as well as just the effort to make basic science understandable across the cultural board, so to speak. These are great answers. Reaching people where they're at while also broadening horizons. For sure, this is a huge part of why we're doing this, is reaching people where they're at. Not just getting people to come to where we are. It's really important to go where people are. Priya, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that was great. And I was just reading some of where we're all from. So it looks like Nancy, your mom is Swiss, from the French speaking part. That's really interesting. Nathan's from Lincoln, Nebraska. We have Galveston, Texas, English and small bits of ASL. Nancy's from Moscow. I actually didn't know there was a Moscow in Idaho. So I learned something new. So a lot of different languages, it looks like, and different parts of the States and also some other countries as well reflected in our audience.
Yeah. And Nathan's, commented like so much science is global, and that's very important, right? That is a huge part of why we're doing this as well. And in science communication, if you have done any science communication, a huge thing is know your audience. That's a huge part of how to do science communication. And so, but we can't look at our audience as just like a faceless, indistinct public. And so this is why it's important to do multicultural, multilingual science communication, because our audience, when we go specific, these are important factors how we communicate. It makes the science more accessible and relatable, and our audience, our participants, can actually see themselves in science. They can see that they belong in the context of science, whether or not they're doing the research or just being engaged with it. So then we want to pass on another question. What are some barriers to multicultural and multilingual science communication from your personal experience, or just theoretically, what do you think makes it difficult? What are some of the constraints that you may see? This might be a tough question. assumption that English is the language of science. For sure, that is a huge part of it. And we're going to touch on a little bit of that as well. Translations, yes, translations are difficult, especially when a lot of us here learn science in English. Yes, English becomes a default language in large multicultural groups. These are great. Yeah, I think you want to do the presentation for us? These are exactly points that we have been personally dealing with, and as well why we want to do this. More of this sort of science communication. Great. So Priya.
Yeah, so in working with Lotus STEM, so in the spring of 2020, Lotus STEM, as I mentioned, which is the South Asian STEM networking organization for South Asian women, based in Toronto. However, we do have a global membership and volunteers and individuals working with us around the world. Now, in 2020, when COVID-19 hit, we in the community, in the South Asian community, and in other communities as well, were seeing that there were a lot of myths and misinformation being spread, particularly in communities where English might not have been the first language. And so access to information and access to evidence-informed information was perhaps difficult to encounter. So in the spring of 2020, Lotus STEM launched a series of COVID-19 explainer videos in different languages. So many scientists, academics, students volunteered to help us with this task. A group of 12 people created videos in 12 different South Asian languages, as well as Filipino and Arabic. We also translated the information for hearing impaired communities. The topics included dispelling COVID-19 myths, providing accurate fact-based information about the virus. We tackled topics including symptoms, precautions to prevent transmission, and it was very well received. And we heard from many members of the community who said that this was so useful for them and that they were sending these videos through WhatsApp to dispel some of the myths that they were receiving through these channels. We also asked our volunteers about their experiences of engaging in multicultural, multilingual science communication, something that perhaps they had not had the previous experience of engaging in. So we asked them, what was the hardest part of participating in this initiative and what was the easiest for them? And this is what we heard. So the first quote says, "I was trying my best to hide that I'm struggling while speaking in my native language. Writing the script in my native language, I really had to dig deep to be able to effectively communicate. I learned new words in my language that I normally wouldn't have ever used." And these are individuals who, speak at home in their native languages to their parents, but they've never had the opportunity to communicate this information and this type of information to others, to their own communities in their native languages. Now, as we go through, we encourage you also to think about your own comfort levels and how you would feel if you were asked to communicate your science or research in your native language or to your cultural audience. And if you were to do that, what cultural or linguistic concepts would you draw on or use, similar to what Celia had mentioned with DOSA?
Yeah, and I wanted to sort of jump in at this point. Obviously, these were really difficult parts of translating these scripts into their native language. But I wanted to say what is a weakness is also a strength, because they don't necessarily have access to scientific jargon, but nor do a lot of our audiences or participants. So that's actually a strength that we have to figure out how to explain these scientific concepts without these technical terms. How do we explain all of that? I mean, that is basic science communication, whereas we want to avoid using jargon, or if we do use jargon, we have to explain it in a way that makes sense and is clear and hopefully not patronizing or condescending. So this is actually a really great way to be more accessible to other communities, or maybe minority or underrepresented communities.
Now, as a public health journalist, I had the wonderful opportunity to actually visit a hotspot neighborhood in the city of Toronto. Now, as we know, research has shown that hotspots where communities of multi-generational, multicultural individuals live often has a higher risk. Now, this is a quote from a community outreach worker who I had the opportunity to speak with. She told me how she, as a member of this community, she speaks Punjabi. She's been there for 30 years and working with these communities for 30 years. So they trusted her. She was their source of information. She told me how happy she was when she had the ability to answer their phone calls, provide them information in their languages with a cultural understanding that she brought, and how this enabled them to trust her and also obtain the information that they needed in order to make good choices during a pandemic, a situation that many of us have never experienced before. Now, and it's become, especially during COVID, during this pandemic, it's become really clear how important it is for us as science communicators and people working with different communities to be able to provide information that is culturally specific and also linguistically specific.
Yeah, I want to add to that. My parents also, they don't choose their medical professional based on solely are they good doctors. They choose people who speak their language and who they can understand, because if they can't communicate with their doctor, it's not helpful to them either. So that's important to keep in mind. And Priya.
Sorry.
Sorry, it's okay.
So we asked our volunteers why it was important for them to participate in an initiative, a multicultural, multilingual science communication initiative for COVID, and why they wanted to participate. And what they said was they wanted to build trust. They wanted to build awareness and understanding, and the recognition that not everyone consumes science news in English. So seeing someone from your community speaking languages that you speak and understand really helps with trusting the news. And also there isn't enough being done outside of English to combat myths. So, these are things that you also have told us, right? That, there's this understanding that English sometimes has become the traditional means of conveying information. However, it's not always the best way in which different communities and different groups access information.
Yeah, and this, I think, speaks to as well to the cultural aspect. It's hard to think about science in the context of culture because it tends to be quite distinct when we learn about science in Canada and the US. And there are communities that have been unethically used by science or by Western communities. So that's also important to keep in mind in terms of trust. Why should they trust you with the information that you're providing or discussing about, right?
Now, I had the fortune actually a couple of years ago to write a story about the teaching of native languages in our schools. So this is also a barrier to multicultural, multilingual science communication, because often we're finding that teaching students their native languages isn't really a priority. That's not how science is taught. That's not how different subjects are taught. And so I spoke with an academic. Her name is Gail Prasad. She works actually in the States, but she's from Toronto. And what she had to tell me still stays with me, even though I spoke with her in 2019. So her research is on working with children and understanding how to bring plurilingual, so that's people who speak different languages, how they're able to use those languages in their education and in their normal day-to-day life. So she has really focused her research and trying to understand how to enable this and how to encourage people to speak their native languages and learn about it in their native languages. So what she told me was that her parents spoke 5 languages between themselves, but they only taught her English. And this is ultimately what led her into this research path. And she said that, even though Toronto is extremely diverse, that there are almost 120 languages being spoken in the country or in the city, yet because we do not prioritize teaching languages in our school system, ultimately, Toronto is a city where languages come to die. So she said it's a linguistic graveyard. If you think about that, you effectively have kids who are leaving schools with less than they started because they end up either losing their language or not prioritizing it.
Yeah, and language can be quite closely tied with culture. And as a child of immigrants, like, for sure, I do not maintain the same level of cultural and heritage understanding or awareness as my parents do. And like, I know of the general factors, but I could not give you specific details. So I think that is part of why this is such a passion project for us. So what is our strategy then in terms of reaching our own communities and communities that are underrepresented? We came up with this series of workshops to sort of equip other people called Expanding Horizons. So we kind of go through 4 different aspects of science communication, the basics of evidence-based science communication, kind of go over really briefly sort of what that looks like, and then the art of storytelling, and then a more exploratory session about the intersection of science and culture. And the last thing that we talk about is evaluation, because we need to know how we are reaching our communities and how to improve. There's always room for improvement, and we don't want to negatively impact the communities we reach. So it's important to do this evaluation. And that's why we thought it was really important to include that aspect into our series. And it all ends with a showcase. All our participants will be working on a project throughout this whole series and will basically show us what they've come up with. And we're hoping that from that, they will continue to do more multicultural, multilingual science communication. And throughout all of these workshops, we will make sure that there's a focus in terms of connecting with our culture and different languages, and just thinking about jargon in a different way, and really getting personal, because that's really how we can reach people. So when we think about science communication and the history of science that we learn about is traditionally very Eurocentric. And it's less so now, but science communication has traditionally been just like informing people. And it almost sees people as empty buckets to fill with all of this information that we want them to know. And this can be a bit paternalistic and patronizing, especially with minority communities who have been harmed by science. And so it's important to sort of see science communication as more collaborative, more dialogic in this way, especially with minority communities. Yeah, so that's sort of the what we're hoping as one of the goals for a science communication first workshop. And Priya can tell you a little bit about storytelling.
So another workshop that we will be touching on is storytelling. Now, why storytelling? I think that each one of us, if we were to trace back to our ancestors, can find at one time someone sitting by a fire telling a story to others, either through art, through oral reciting, through song, dance, or play. Storytelling, as we know, has been an intrinsic part of cultures and histories for a very long time. And it was a very important way that cultures used to understand the world around them and build knowledge and share that knowledge on to others, to their children, to their children's children. Often, many cultures have that oral storytelling tradition, and that's the main way in which the ways of knowing and how they saw and understood the world was passed on. So, and increasingly now, as I'm sure all of you are aware, storytelling and science communication are, it's increasingly understood that there is that importance of bringing storytelling aspects into science communication. So we hope to cover, things like simple things like building narrative, to sort of reframe how we think about how we share our knowledge and to reframe it in the ways of storytelling. And as these quotes tell us, storytelling is one of the most powerful ways to share ideas and to exchange information. because they get to that sort of root, which is our feelings. And those, for a long time, science has, been very objective, but we know that all of us as humans have feelings, and those all go into science and our research. And so storytelling is a helpful way to kind of get at those aspects of being human. So as we kind of continue, what are the stories of your people or of the cultures that you identify with, and start, think about how you would kind of intersperse those, right, with your science and or your research.
And then our third session about the intersection of science and culture, we're really hoping to have people explore their own culture and their own experience or language, and see where science and culture have met, because they're not, they don't not influence each other, even though we tend to see science as objective. So when have they met? When should they have met, perhaps, where moments of missed science, where science was unexplored because of cultural stigma. For example, here's a picture of tofu, the first Chinese woman in America to get a medical degree in 1888. Her name was Qin Yamei. She actually introduced tofu to the USDA because during World War I, because they were looking for a source of protein that wasn't meat. They were running low on meat. And tofu was a great alternative, but because of its connection to East Asian cuisine, it wasn't accepted. Now, everyone eats tofu, or for the most part, tofu is quite well accepted. But in 1888, the world was not ready, or the Western world was not quite ready for it. So this is an example where, science and culture did kind of meet, but, they didn't quite make it. And so where else do we have moments of these when science and culture should have met? Or even where has science been overlooked because it came from a different culture? I think those are also important stories to look at, the positives and the negatives. So we kind of want to pass it on to you for a little bit, for about 10 to 15 minutes or so. Think about your research or your favorite scientific concepts, and then think of your own culture. How would you communicate that concept with cultural references and or in your non-English language? This might be a tough one. 10 to 15 minutes is not long enough, but maybe it might require some Googling or some thinking or creativity. You don't have to come up with anything concrete. We just want to sort of exercise thinking about that. So we'll give you 10 to 15 minutes to do so.
Does anyone want to share any preliminary thoughts that they might be having in terms of these questions, this activity? Is there a scientific concept that you've identified or are thinking about?
I can share something. It's kind of from my past, but I was a park ranger in national parks across the country. And a lot of French visitors were in these parks. And I noticed that their attitude towards the parks was very different. And I hadn't been living there as an adult in the French-speaking culture for a long time. And they came across as kind of rude and diffident, and I didn't know where that was coming from. So I started giving talks in French. I did guided ranger talks, and once I was speaking in their language, their attitude totally changed. They were very receptive, and I was able to explain how these national parks are different from what they were used to, which was a more managed park with lovely trails and cafes everywhere, and we could feed the animals. Those are all things that weren't okay in our U.S. national parks. So I just found that by, again, speaking in their language and being able to explain the purpose and the mission of the U.S. national park system was just a huge bridge. And then they really embraced, I saw a change in their attitude. They sort of embraced what we were doing and understood the difference. So I think for me as a naturalist, that's kind of my early research interest and understanding the culture, because I was able to communicate with them, made a huge difference in their experience.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. That's a great example.
It's an incredible story. Thanks for sharing, Nancy.
Sure. Yeah.
So my focus now in my career path is actually science communication. I teach science communication courses at Duke, and I also obviously do a lot with broader impacts and science outreach. But my previous life before I started doing all this was as an immunologist. My PhD is in immunology. And when I was back in my immunology days and doing bench work and research, I was collaborating at one point with some scientists from the Pasteur Institute, which is in Paris. And I had the really cool opportunity early in my career to travel there for about a month and work in one of their labs. And it was such an eye-opening experience for me, because not just obviously the language difference, and you know, I spoke just barely enough French to survive, but the main thing was just the cultural differences in how science was approached, because I was coming from this very sort of high-powered lab where, you know, we all worked 60, 70, 80 hours a week and, you know, got in early and stayed late and worked weekends and all of that. And they spent the first week just getting me to sort of shed that mentality. And, you know, they would roll in every morning at, you know, 9 or 9:30 and spend the first hour drinking coffee and just talking about science, you know, and then they would go out to a 2-hour lunch with wine and talk about science. And then, you know, and it was such a different approach. And they were doing fantastic work. It wasn't like we were somehow twice as productive in our lab because we did twice as much work or spent twice as many hours in the lab. It was just a totally different approach. And it was such an eye-opening experience for me to see that there are different ways to approach doing science, and that it brings so much of their culture, you know. And you know, like I would tell them, like they would say, you know, when do you eat breakfast? And I would say, well, I'll eat something in my car driving
Ready to go.
you know, and that was just appalling to them that I would eat a meal. You know, well, how do you have your coffee when you're driving? You know, how do you have the, you know, it was such anyway, so that cultural difference that had almost nothing to do with language and everything to do with just the way they approached life
For sure.
was a really interesting experience for me.
Yeah, I think that just sort of goes to show that science isn't like totally divorced from culture. Culture does influence how science is done and just what science is done in terms of research, what areas are explored. So thank you for that. Yeah. Anyone else want to share? Or I think there's someone in the chat potentially. Yeah. Just Rupali's yes, I understand the 60 to 70 hour work week.
As an immunologist.
Yeah.
Well, it's all disciplines of science, right? I mean,
For sure.
Yeah.
in the US at least, no matter what discipline it is, and not just science, obviously, but certainly within science, it's, you know, there's this mentality that more hours equals better science, and that's not always true.
For sure. And even, so I actually studied in Vancouver, so the West Coast, and I did a co-op there, a public health co-op. And I just found, you know, even ways of writing emails were just very different. I was writing very formally and I'd get responses that were, yeah, that's good, all good. And I was like, okay. So even, you know, even within countries, there are those like little differences that you mentioned, Jory, that can, in terms of how we work. And yeah, it's really a great point that you make.
I'm from the Northeast originally. I was born in Massachusetts, and the differences between Massachusetts, Jersey, where I went to high school, and then down in Texas, where I am now, it was almost a culture shock, because in Massachusetts, anything more than like 20, 30 minutes is, you need to plan like a week ahead of time if you're going to go that far. In Jersey, 30 minutes to an hour, you can kind of do with a day planning. Down here, 30 minutes is a quick trip. you have to hit over 4 hours before it becomes a day trip. Like, and so like, even like little things like that were like, you had to like pick up on that. And I mean, obviously it's a size different things, but then it's also what they call different types of pizza. Like a supreme pizza in Texas is an everything pizza in Jersey, which is a garbage pizza in Massachusetts. So it's just learning those things, even on the very American side of things. It's like, I can't even imagine what kind of regional differences you'll end up with within other cultures, because I'm one person and only lived in 3 places, and yet those things took me forever. And I found things that like annoyed me. Like I said, you guys, when I came to Texas, and they all assumed I said, you guys, which annoyed me to no end for no reason other than that's not what I was saying. And so my friends were like, well, I'll put up with the wicked if you learn to say y'all, which took 3 weeks. And it was 3 separate syllables at first. So it's like giving people that grace, kind of like learning where they're at and finding their little quirks, and like finding your equivalent can even make a huge difference, even within your own little bubbles.
For sure. Yeah, I think it makes a huge difference. And I mean, I when you were talking about that, I actually thought about like comedians and how they go to different cities, and they always find something about that city to talk about, to riff on, that gets the audience engaged. And I think the same thing should happen with science communication, where we learn these quirks and figure out like what makes our audience and our participants feel seen and related to. So yeah, that's great. Anyone else want to share, or even share how that process has been? Like, I know for me, sometimes these things come to me, but also they can be very difficult to find these connections. Or, you know, that story about tofu, I didn't even, like, someone just sent it to me. They were like, I think you would think this is interesting. And I'm like, yes, I do. But when I'm thinking back about like, how would I find this story? I don't know how. So like it is, this process is admittedly can be very hard, but it can also just come to you, I feel like. So yeah, if anyone wants to share their experience in that, or any other ideas that we come up with, we'd love to hear.
I have some examples of science communications in different areas.
Sure. Yeah.
One of the girls I worked with in college got her PhD, and she decided, she's from Mexico, she wanted to raise awareness about the vaquita, which has at least gotten some national recognition because they're cute, and you know, megafauna do well with those things. But she wrote a little kid's storybook in Spanish and distributed it about this little baby vaquita, and talked a little bit about the lifestyle and why it was struggling to find its mom and things like that. And so she wrote an engaging story to try to engage the younger people, who could then, you know, be like, Mom, why is this a problem? Dad, why is this a problem? Like trying to like do that bottom up approach.
Yeah.
And then our director of research, we were talking when we first started Broader Impacts a year and a half ago, we were talking about different things we could try to put up on our website for our faculty members to see. And he was reminded of, they made a junior high level newsletter about environmental problems in Colombia, where he's from, and tried to pull in like local examples of, you might have seen this. This is an example of this scientific principle, and it was all written out, and it was colorful with little illustrations and things like that. And so I'd love to be able to create things on that line, but I don't always have the expertise. So that's why I reach out and find other people who do.
Yes, that's an important part of the process. It's hard to like, especially if you're not familiar with the culture or another community, sort of doing a Google search isn't necessarily always enough. But talking to people from those communities and working together with them is an important part of the process, because they know from firsthand experience, right? Google is not always sort of a very like theoretical approach and may not actually work out in practice. So that's awesome. Yeah.
Nathan had left a comment, and I wanted to ask a question about that too, just to the audience. He'd said how storytelling is foundational, and the last time I was in DC, program officers at ED, NEH, and NSF all asked colleagues, "What story are you trying to tell?" Do you have any interesting experiences where storytelling has been interspersed in some way with science communication, and what was that like?
So, I mean, I don't know that I have a specific example, but I'll just say, we've always, from research impact, from a proposal development perspective, really try and encourage the faculty we work with to tell, to make sure that their proposal is telling a really compelling, exciting story, right? That in the stack of, a dozen, 3 dozen, hundreds of proposals that a review committee has to consider, right? You want to be memorable and stand out in a good way. So I think, one example I'll remember, I never forget, is someone who now is a chaired professor on our campus. He joined, as a brand new assistant professor, and he took the broader impacts section in a standard NSF proposal extremely, extremely seriously, and teed up that section by telling his own story, right? Like what motivated him to get into science. He started out in one area, came from a low socioeconomic status background in another country, and was just really motivated to pursue this work and hope to inspire others to take up the mantle. And I remember the review comments coming back that said, "Wow, this is so incredible. I've never seen anything like this. This is a standard grant. Why aren't you going for an NSF Career Award?" So I think these stories can resonate and can hook people, get them excited, and help them become advocates for a project, for a particular line of research. It's just critical to getting the funding that people need to do the work.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we're humans, we love stories. That's how we connect. And it's an important part of science communication. It's not enough to just rely on the facts or just like, this is what the research is. But, connecting that to a human story, I think it brings more power to the research, especially sometimes with why people do certain research is a big part of the story. Yeah, amazing. Anyone else, or we can, I guess, start to conclude, wrap up, if there are no other comments. All right, so for us, we're still in development for this workshop, and we're actually working with a lot of other people to get some feedback. And people are getting really excited about this, and want to provide their input. We are working with an Indigenous Heritage Center as well, and he's really excited about the storytelling part. So we're really excited to have all these different perspectives involved. And we're hoping that through these workshops, we can encourage people to feel more confident about reaching their own communities with their science, and have a sort of more dialogic flow of information, of science communication. And then hopefully as a whole, just become better at reaching underrepresented communities through advocates and communicators from those communities, and help people feel seen in the context of science, using strategies that speak to their culture, and ultimately, hopefully have a more informed and engaged, equitably informed and engaged population with science. Yeah. So I don't have anything else to add. Priya, do you want to add anything?
No, I think that was a good summary of what we're trying to do.
Yeah. So if there are no questions, I think that we can end early, but we're happy to also continue discussing, or if you have any other questions about our workshop and how we're working on it, or just in general want to talk about multicultural, multilingual SciComm, we're here. We love it. We're passionate about it, clearly. So, yeah.
Yeah, and thank you everyone for your perspectives and for joining us today. I think we also learned a lot as well from you, from your perspectives and your experiences.
Jory, did you want to add anything, Jory?
I just had a question for you. First of all, just thank you for the session. It was really interesting. And I teach storytelling as a big part of my science communication as well. So I'm glad that we're on the same page with that. But I'm curious if any of you have been involved in the Inclusive SciComm conference that Sunshine Menezes runs out of University of Rhode Island. She's had a couple of them now. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but
No, I'm not, but I'm gonna make a note to look them up.
yeah. So I wasn't able to attend the first one, but I did attend the second one. And I'm happy we can talk offline and I can share with
sure.
you information or connect you with Sunshine. But it's the first one was about 3 years ago, I think, and then the second one was 2 years ago, and then with COVID, everything has been sort of thrown off schedule.
For
But
sure.
but you know, there's I think a groundswell of interest in this country in thinking more about how to be inclusive with science communication efforts. And I've been trying to think about how to merge that with broader impacts and how to do broader impacts activities with an inclusive SciComm approach. So it's great to hear that you're doing similar things up in Canada, and it would be great to have continued conversations and get you connected with Sunshine and her group down here as well.
Yeah, that would be amazing. Yeah, definitely connect us. You have our contact information there, so definitely feel free to reach out there. Yeah, that sounds really cool.
I'm just looking it up now so I can put it in chat and share it with everyone.
Oh, yes, perfect. Is this the Metcalf Institute, or is that something else?
Yeah, hold on, I'll just go ahead and put it in chat. But yeah, so the Metcalf Institute is where Sunshine is based, and that's part of the University of Rhode Island. So,
okay, amazing.
Yeah, so, and I'm trying to remember, I don't have a good sense of whether there were many international participants at the meeting that I attended, but
Right, yeah.
There may have been, but I'm not sure. So,
well, if not, then maybe we can start it.
for sure.
Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, and it's important. As much as like the landscape can be slightly different in different countries, it's always good to have to know how other people do it and how other areas do it. I did my degree in the UK, so coming to Canada was like, oh, this is different. And it's good to sort of exchange and see best practices. So I'd love to get connected for sure.
Dee, I see that you're here. Were you? I
Yeah,
you were.
I was gonna say something. I was like, I should chime in. Hi, I also give workshops and talks in specifically systemic racism in science communication.
Great.
And so a lot of what you're saying resonates, and I was like, oh, I should probably bring up that storytelling thing because I don't actually say that. But I'll email you guys too. So after kind of Black Lives Matter and George Floyd movement kind of was a really, important piece of the United States, news system and society for so long. The demand for this kind of conversation just skyrocketed. I was probably giving that talk 2 to 3 times a month across the United States. So it just seems to be more relevant than ever right now. And I'll invite you guys. I'm trying to think of if I have one on the books, but I'll make sure to invite you guys because I think you could hear about kind of the conversation specifically from sort of how even just the communication landscape is so incredibly, just straight up racist and based on, really a white supremacy system and how that affects the information that we receive from the media and what that means for obviously how news is kind of digested and what the outcomes of that is. And, one of the examples I wanted to bring up, but I give this example specifically on especially this kind of the miscommunication risks. And this is essentially what you're talking about is miscommunication risks as it relates to language and culture. And one of them I wanted to bring up, and I'll bring it up now, is that the World Health Organization set out all of these essentially what would you call it, guidelines and principles for COVID health and COVID how to maintain a healthy community and all these things. And they sent these recommendations for the world, right? So sent them out, and they built this campaign essentially around healthy communities. And one of the things that these NGOs in Africa got were these flyers and media kits and all this that said that in order to prevent COVID spread, wash your hands for 20 seconds under running water. And these leaders at these NGOs in Africa are like, do you know anything about our communities?
Yeah.
Like running water? That's not even a thing, So it's like this, now you put all this money and all this effort into these communication campaigns that literally just like miss the mark.
Yeah.
So anyways, that was one example I want to bring up that you guys I could send you the flyer too, that this NGO, it was about miscommunication and like science communication around like culturally relevant science communication around COVID.
Yeah.
So it was like such a perfect example. I'll send it to you guys, and you guys should use it, because it's like so bonkers, and no one would know at the World Health these NGOs had to rewrite the World Health Organization's content to make it relevant for these communities. Anyways, so that was one example I wanted to share earlier, but I'm shy to speak up.
No worries.
So thanks, Dory. But yeah, I'll let you guys, I'll send you guys some stuff too. And we should chat offline.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing. And this, Black Lives Matter also was a huge deal in Canada. We have similar issues. So definitely like very, very relevant. So thank you so much for sharing and your story. I'm so glad that you were able to share.
Thank you very much for the session.
Thank you so much for joining in. You guys were amazing. Thank you. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.